Welcome to another video on reading the Silmarillion through von Clausewitz's On War. And today we're going to look at a really very interesting part of von Clausewitz. It's in chapter 8. It's the God of War. And I think you're going to see that you actually find this idea in Tolkien as well. But we're also going to look at a number of, a number of commonalities between them, Tolkien and Clausewitz, and at least one, I think, quite significant difference. And again, one of the themes that's emerged over these videos is that Tolkien's war in the Silmarillion really is modern war. So the Jesuit philosopher, theologian, Eric Chavara, he wrote a book called The Analogia Entis, the analogy of being. He says that theories can take up three positions. They tend to be either theories of what he calls univocity, so a kind of a singular principle, or equivocity, a multiplicity in play, or the ideal position, the analogical position. And we'll see if Clausewitz actually develops something like an analogical theory, because the other two aspects, so Chavara thinks that theories sort of oscillate between these positions, and it's only the analogical position that can kind of hold a kind of a stability between the univocity and the equivocity. But you see Clausewitz, and you see Tolkien as well, working with both a univocal and an equivocal idea. So the one position, the univocal, because it's very singular, is very simple. And Clausewitz says right at the start of the book that all war reduces to a duel. I've spoken a little bit about this before, but just to see how it's present in Tolkien, I made a little list of duels, right? So you see Feanor battle the Balrog, Gothmog, Fingolfin battle Melkor, Beren, Karkaroth the wolf, and Erendil and Calagon the dragon, right? So these are all classic duels that happen, and of course, right, in the Iliad, right, you have this constant battle structure of the duel. And with this idea of a kind of a unitary position, you see that in Clausewitz's idea of the coup d'oeil, right? The commander having a sort of a singular vision of the battlescape, and this is basic, he says, to competent strategy. And you see that, of course, right, with Beren, where Beren understands what Fingolfin does not understand. And I think I've spoken a little bit about this before, but on page 150 of the Silmarillion, you see Fingolfin wage war against Melkor, and Tolkien points out that what Fingolfin did not understand was that there was no power in Middle-earth that could defeat Melkor. And of course, this is what Erendil understands, right? And so Erendil finds his way to get back to the gods and to make a supplication that the gods intervene in Middle-earth and help the destruction of Melkor. So Beren in particular, he has this coup d'oeil, right? He sees the fundamental strategic problem that Fingolfin is crazy gifted elf, right, but still could not quite yet appreciate. But this maybe brings us to the important issue, right, of the equivocal position. So about equivocity, Clausewitz says, quote, the vast, the almost infinite distance there can be between a cause and its effect, right? So on the one hand, right, he says this again and again, on the one hand, war is very simple. It's the overthrow of the enemy. But on the other hand, it's incredibly complex. And here how he puts it, right? There's an almost infinite distance between cause and effect. And this is why, right, keeping things clear to the mind about how the causes are working is so tricky. But you do see this in Tolkien, right? Because think about Aragon, and he's burdened by the idea of this deep ancestral history that he might be a second Isildur. So a feature of Tolkien's work is this kind of, right, they're constantly running up against the ruins of previous battles, previous civilizations, and all of these things, right, are part of the kind of the causal architecture of the fate of the forces of the West, and of course even others. But also the problem, and this is where I think Clausewitz is really interesting, and Tolkien as well. The problem is, what is that connection between cause and effect? What Clausewitz asks is, where can you draw a line such that you no longer need to understand the causes, right? So you'll still succeed militarily, even though you've kind of cut off the pursuit of the causal chain. And he comes up with this very interesting example. So if I may just go there, this is page 144. Sorry, I'm going to get there. Here's what he says. He says the range and effectiveness of different firearms is tactically most important. Yep. But here it comes, right? But their construction, though it governs their performance, is irrelevant. The conduct of war has nothing to do with making guns and powder out of coal, sulfur, saltpeter, copper, and tin. Its given quantities are weapons that are ready for use and their effectiveness. Strategy uses maps without worrying about trigonometric surveys. It does not inquire how a country should be organized and a people trained and ruled in order to produce the best military results. So I think here, right, this is, some people point this out about Clausewitz, that he wasn't overly interested in the sort of the logistic structures. But maybe there's another point here about he's not picking up on, and for obvious reasons, the industrial nature of war, and that in fact, right, you do need to understand these sort of deeper underlying phenomena. Because there's an example in Tolkien where I think this comes up, and I think it's, I don't know, I think it's really interesting. So page 202, 201 and 202, it's the issue of Belloc and his sword. And the sword is Anglashell. And it's in the gift of King Thingol. And it was a sword of great worth. And it was so named because it was made of iron that fell from heaven as a blazing star. It would cleave all earth-delved iron, right? So it's kind of a meteor. But also very interesting astral metaphysics, right, where the celestial has priority over the terrestrial. One other sword only in Middle-earth was like to it. The sword does not enter into this tale, though it was made by the same. It's made of the same ore by the same smith. That smith was Eol, the dark elf, right? A super problematic character. His son is Megalin, another super problematic character. And so the sword was given to Belloc. But here's what happens over the page. But as Thingol turned the hilt of Anglashell towards Belog, Queen Melian looked at the blade, and she said, "There is malice in this sword. The dark heart of the smith still dwells in it." And of course, it is going to lead to ruination. In fact, it's going to lead to Belog's death. Because the sword is duplicitous. So it's a little bit like the ring, right? The duplicity of the ring. So what does this point to? Tolkien sees that actually the constitutive elements, even of a weapon, is very, very crucial. So I think this is a very interesting difference between the two thinkers. And again, for me, it points to the fact that whereas Clausewitz doesn't think that things like saltpeter, or we might say today rare earth minerals, are that relevant, Tolkien clearly does think they're that relevant. And this, I think, maybe points to that industrial mindset. Or oddly enough, right, given Tolkien's own sort of dislike of the commercial, right, kind of commercial, the commercial depth to the problem of war. But at any rate, it touches upon this problem of resources and resource knowledge. And this brings us to the God of War, right? And what is so interesting here, and this is on page 583 of the Princeton edition, what's so interesting here is the way that Clausewitz expresses this. He says, the God of War himself. And this, of course, is Clausewitz's great enemy, is Napoleon. So let's read. So Napoleon is a stand-in for the phenomenon, the God of War. The God of War is the idea that wars are total, or they can be total resource wars, right? So war in modernity is a total resource phenomenon. So let's read a few things that are said about the God of War, right? I mean, it's just cool that he personifies it in Napoleon, because it's Napoleon who first understands this. But I don't think Napoleon was alone in first understanding it, actually. We'll come to that in a second, because I want to give a couple of examples just to illustrate what Clausewitz is getting at. So if you look at page 580 we read, so what happens is wars, says Clausewitz, are typically conducted in a very inconsistent way. And I think you see that actually in Tolkien. That Melkor has a lot of tools in his shed, but he doesn't deploy them, right? It's always very... right, he's a somewhat anxious, strangely anxious person, Melkor, right? He's always keeping something in reserve, or he's always experimenting with yet other ways to damage people. So here's what, on page 580, Clausewitz says. This is its usual appearance, the idea that war is inconsistently pursued. And one might wonder whether there is any truth at all in our concept of the absolute character of war. Right? So this is what the God of War is, the absolute character. Were it not for the fact that with our own eyes, we have seen warfare achieve this state of absolute perfection. Napoleon. After the short prelude of the French Revolution, Bonaparte brought it swiftly and ruthlessly to that point. War in his hands was waged without respite until the enemy succumbed and the counter blows were struck with almost equal energy. So that's an earlier point that he makes, right? That when the violence is deployed, you're only going to survive if you can somehow deploy. I mean, maybe in some asymmetric way, right? But you've got to be able to deploy something comparable, right? Because you're always trying to, a judo move, right? Or a wrestling move, right? You're always trying to overthrow your enemy. So you have to reciprocate, right? So I suppose this might be what they sort of call the escalation ladder, right? But there's got to be some sort of parity. So he says, war in his hands was waged without respite until the enemy succumbed and the counter blows were struck with almost equal energy. Surely it is both natural and inescapable that this phenomenon should cause us to turn again to the pure concept of war with all of its rigorous implications. But recall, right, the pure concept of war almost, it doesn't really happen, right, because you're always trying to solve a political problem. And politics is really messy. And there's enormous friction. So you don't ever quite attain to the pure concept. But with Napoleon, you've started to definitely move in that direction. And you're going to see it does happen in the Silmarillion. And so he says, if theory can effectively trace this phenomenon, it is because of recent wars, without the cautionary examples of the destructive power and war unleashed, theory would preach to deaf ears. No one would have believed possible what has now been experienced by all, right? This idea of total war. Right, the god of war. And so if you look at 583, what happens is that Clausewitz here compares the Frederick the Great Wars and the way in which those were copied for so long. But then with this, at the onset of the 19th century, peoples themselves were in the scale on either side, right? So these like population wars, national wars, nation wars, as opposed to kingly wars. The generals opposing Frederick the Great were acting on instructions from kings in the background, which implied that caution was one of their distinguishing characteristics. But now the opponent is talking about the start of the 19th century. But now the opponent of the Austrians and the Prussians was, to put it bluntly, the god of war, capital G, capital W, the god of war himself, right? So note how you see this actually in Tolkien, right? I mean, as the Silmarillion progresses, you finally arrive at the god of war. So let's just look at that. So Erendil, he understands this. And so the thing that I wanted to mention is that we see the god of war, right, in the Second World War with the Soviets and the way that they could marshal the sort of the entire fabric of their population to destroy Germany. But in Napoleon's time, of course, the other person who totally understood this, not just Napoleon, but another contemporary who understood this, of course, was Nelson. Right? So Horatio Nelson understands this idea that his ships, they are industry writ large. Right? They're the most expensive objects on the planet. They're the most complicated objects on the planet. They're the most violent objects of the planet. And he's the guy who understands that this is where we're at. he understands how they can be used, right? So there's no hesitation. This is this famous idea, right, where he says, just go straight at him, right? Because he understands that you're bringing the god of war to bear. Look at how this happens in Tolkien, right? So what's really important here, right, in terms of the art, is that I want to suggest that Tolkien's battlescape is modern. I mean, despite its medieval trappings, it's modern. So if we look at page 251 and 252 of the Silmarillion, so what happens is that at the last, the might of Valinor came up out of the west, and the challenges of the trumpets filled the sky. The host of the Valar were arrayed in forms young and fair and terrible. The meeting of the hosts of the west and of the north is named the Great Battle, the War of Wrath. There was marshalled the whole power of the throne of Morgoth, right? So now it's gone to total war. But it did not avail him. The Balrogs were destroyed, save some that fled. Legions of orcs perished like straw in a great fire. But then what happens? Page 252. Thus, when he sees his power beginning to disappear, Morgoth quailed, but he dared not come forth himself. But he loosed upon his foes the last desperate assault that he had prepared, and out of the pits of Angband there issued the winged dragons, as had not been seen before, right? And actually what happens is the Valar retreat. But then Erendil comes down with the eagles, and there is a great battle. But Erendil came shining with white flame, and about Vingalot were gathered all the great birds of heaven, and Thorondor was their captain, and there was battle in the air all the day and through a dark night of doubt. Before the rising of the sun, Erendil slew. Right, so now, interestingly, right, we're back to the duel. Erendil slew and Calagon the Black, the mightiest of the dragon host, and he's slung down and he lands on the top of the castle, and the castle shakes, right, and breaks apart, right, revealing Melkor, sort of perhaps quaking and quivering, right, because he says, there Morgoth stood at last at bay, and yet unvaliant. Okay, so I think what you see there, right, is the God of War idea. And Clausewitz is very clear, right? This is a very modern idea. It really is sort of inaugurated by the passions of the French Revolution, and it's clearly seen by Napoleon. And I would say Napoleon perhaps sees the political reality of nationalism, but Nelson sees the military/political reality of industrialization. Final point on this, and I think again super interesting. I think Clausewitz was alert to this problem, the problem of industrialization, because he says that war, the best way to think about war is as commerce, that's an analogy. And he says, because in commerce, you have, quote, this is on page 149, you have a conflict of human interests and activities. And then he also says, of course, that it's like politics, right? So business and politics, you have this conflict of interests. But what Adam Smith argues, that the fundamental core, and I think this is super interesting, that the fundamental core of business is oratory, rhetoric, persuasive speech. Because, of course, right, what you're trying to do, right, as a business person and indeed as a consumer, right, you're trying to find the alignment of desire and product. And it is interesting, this idea that Smith has of business or commerce as rhetoric, as narrative, is of course something you find in war, right? So Alexander the Great goes on campaign and he carries the Iliad. Nelson thought of himself as Achilles. So what you have in Clausewitz is, I think, the insight that war is about resources and it's about literary resources, right? So it's about the sciences, so to say, and it's about the arts, right? That there is some sort of deep relationship. This is what Smith points out about commerce. And this is actually something you find in Thucydides. So I'll just read a little something from the Peloponnesian Wars. So after the Sicilian expedition, when the Athenians are wiped out, the Spartans are going to win now. The strategic defeat has happened. And Thucydides starts reflecting on the deep sort of years of war. And he says, but here, as on many other occasions, the Spartans proved the most convenient people in the world for the Athenians to be at war with. And that's because, right, it goes on for so long and the Athenians score lots of points, right, before the catastrophic end. The wide difference between the two characters, the slowness and want of energy of the Spartans, as contrasted with the dash and the enterprise, right, the commercial enterprise of their opponents, the Athenians, proved of the greatest service, especially to a maritime empire like Athens. But indeed, this was shown by the Syracusans, right? Because the Syracusans, along with the Spartans, who ultimately defeat the Athenians, indeed, this was shown by the Syracusans, who were most like the Athenians in character, right? See, they're a democratic people. They're a people of the spoken word, right? So what you see is the military prowess of Syracuse is linked rhetorically, right? So commerce and rhetoric, as you would expect, per Adam Smith. Indeed, this was shown by the Syracusans, who were most like the Athenians in character and also most successful in combating them. So I think what's super interesting here is the emerging out of Clausewitz is this idea that war has dual resources. The sort of the material power resource and then the narrative rhetorical resources. And you do notice this in Tolkien, because you get the speech of Feanor, right? So when Feanor kicks it all off, right? Because Feanor rebels against the gods. Yes, Melkor has stolen the Silmarils. Yes, Melkor is an absolute nuisance. But really what happens to the elves is a function of Feanor's rebellion against the gods. And how does he do it? In a great speech, right? So, if we may, this is on page 82. So what I'm claiming here, right, is that the war, in Tolkien's mind, Tolkien is like Clausewitz. He understands the narrative structure. He understands. He understands why people like Nelson think of himself as an Achilles. He understands why Alexander the Great goes to war. Tolkien, of course, knew the Peloponnesian Wars, the Thucydides, very, very well. And so he knows, right, that the Syracusans are the match of the Athenians because they are a speaking people. So when, it's very interesting this, when Thucydides says that when the Spartans would go to parley with the Athenians, the Spartans would step out of character. Instead of being so laconic, right, not wanting to speak very much, they actually took on the volubility of the Athenians to try to kind of make their persuasive case, right? So their diplomats would, as it were, model themselves on Athenian speech. So you see this, or something comparable to this, right? This idea of war as speech. You see it when Feanor rebels, right? And so this is what kicks off, right, the catastrophe of the elves. So Feanor was a master of words, page 82. Feanor was a master of words, and his tongue had great power over hearts when he would use it. And that night he made a speech before the Noldor, which they ever remembered. Fierce and fell were his words, and filled with anger and pride. And hearing them, the Noldor were stirred to madness. And then he says, why, O people of the Mold, right? So classical, right? Why, O people of the Noldor, why should we longer serve the jealous Valar, who cannot keep us nor even their own realm secure from the enemy? Even though he be now their foe, are not they and he of one kin? So really a dark little insinuation. Now, very interesting actually. Tolkien says that some of these words basically put into the mouth of Feanor. He didn't realise it, but Feanor was sort of already under a bit of a spell from Melkor, right? And it's Melkor that's sort of feeding him the lines. But this just goes then to the Clausewitzian Adam Smith point that war is a case of words, of rhetoric, of the beauty of speech, right? And if I may just end with a contemporary, or a Catholic contemporary of the Catholic Tolkien, David Jones, who also was in the infantry in World War I. And he says this about Nelson. So to go back to Nelson. So this is from David Jones, the poet, the modernist poet. He says, Nelson, writing to Lady Hamilton before Trafalgar, of the feeling shown by the senior officers of the fleet when he disclosed to them his dispositions of battle. Right? You see the aesthetics and the sort of the rhetoric, the persuasive speech, right? The dispositions of battle. Says, and this is now a quote, he's saying, some shed tears, this is Nelson, in his letter to Lady Hamilton, Some shed tears. All approved. It was new. It was singular. It was simple. The God of War. And then David Jones. Is this the splendor formae of St. Thomas Aquinas? Quoting Thomas Aquinas, shining in their proportioned parts? Is this the shining in the proportioned parts of Aquinas as the art of naval attack? So, what I hope you've seen is this first super cool, interesting idea of the God of War. God of War is a resource war. The resources are twofold: problem of power and the problem of rhetoric or persuasive speech. I think that raises a fundamental Tolkien theme, which is this kind of the aesthetics or the problem of beauty or war as in the domain, in the fundamental theatre of aesthetics. And I hope we've touched upon the possible difference, but I'm not so sure I'm not so sure that Tolkien and Clausewitz are too far apart on this, actually. But that Tolkien understands the, as it were, the industrial structure. So, that is to say, that Tolkien's thinking about war is industrial. It's like Nelson. It's like Napoleon. That in reading the Silmarillion through Clausewitz, we see, and I think not for the first time, that Tolkien's war is a war of modernity. Okay, well, that's it for today. Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye.